Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita. Today we're going deep on a paper about experimental design, specifically in marketing research.
Oh, you mean like, setting up those A/B tests and things?
Well, it's a little more complex than that, but yeah, kind of. We're talking about a specific approach called the Taguchi method.
Okay, Taguchi method.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, first off, you got to know, this paper was published in the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science.
Which is?
A pretty big deal. It's a top-tier FT50 journal, so, it's legit.
Okay, so we're dealing with the big leagues here.
Exactly. And the authors Jordan Moffett and Patrick Fennell are really well respected in this area.
All right, so what exactly are these experts saying about experimental design?
Well, they start by pointing out a common problem in marketing research.
Which is?
A lot of studies use really small-scale experiments, or they only look at correlations.
Yeah.
That doesn't always give you the full picture of how things work in the real world.
Right. It's like trying to judge a whole pizza just by one bite.
Exactly. There are so many factors at play, and those traditional methods, sometimes they oversimplify things.
So this Taguchi approach is a way to get a more complete picture.
Yeah, it's a method that lets researchers study a lot of different variables all at the same time without needing a huge sample size or tons of money.
I'm liking the sound of this already.
Oh, and get this, it was actually developed by an engineer named Taguchi.
Makes sense?
It's been used a lot in engineering and agriculture, and now it's making its way into marketing.
Okay, so how does this Taguchi approach work? I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty.
Well, it all comes down to designing really efficient experiments. It uses these things called orthogonal arrays, which might sound a little intimidating, but
they're not that bad once you understand them.
Exactly. Think of it like a spreadsheet.
I can do spreadsheets.
Each row is a different experiment, and each column is a variable. Like, the color of a product's packaging or the size of the logo.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Orthogonal arrays make sure that you're changing those variables in a way that lets you see the effect of each one without having to test out every single possible combination.
So it's like a shortcut to getting all the important information.
Exactly. And the best part is it still lets you figure out those cause and effect relationships.
That's so important because a lot of times marketing research only gets as far as correlations.
Right. But the Taguchi method takes you a step further, so you can actually say, this variable causes this outcome.
And that gives you much more confidence when making decisions.
Absolutely.
So the paper highlights 4 key advantages of this approach.
It saves you resources, it establishes causality, it lets you look at interaction effects, and it helps with theory building.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
I feel like each one of those deserves its own little deep dive.
Yeah. Let's start with resource savings. Since it's so efficient, you can study a lot of variables without needing a ton of money or participants.
Makes sense. Efficiency is always a good thing.
Now for causality. Remember how we talked about how the Taguchi method lets you go beyond just correlations?
Yeah, you can actually see what's causing what.
That's super important for making good decisions. You want to be sure that your marketing actions are leading to the results you're seeing.
Makes sense. You don't want to be chasing shadows.
Exactly. Now for interaction effects, this is where things get really interesting.
I love interesting. Lay it on me.
Interaction effects happen when the impact of one variable actually depends on the level of another variable.
Okay, can you give me a real-world example of that?
Sure. Let's say you're running an ad campaign.
Been there, done that.
The effectiveness of your ad copy might depend on who your target audience is. Maybe one message works well for younger people, while another one connects better with an older audience.
Oh yeah, like how you wouldn't market denture adhesive to teenagers.
Exactly. The Taguchi approach helps you figure out those kinds of nuances.
That's cool. It's like realizing that one ingredient can taste totally different depending on what else you mix it with.
Perfect analogy. And finally, we have theory building,
Which is?
taking a step back and using the results of your research to develop a deeper understanding of how marketing works as a whole.
So it's not just about testing specific ideas, but figuring out the bigger picture.
Exactly. By exploring more variables and relationships, you can start to see patterns and build more comprehensive theories about consumer behavior.
So it's like putting together a giant marketing puzzle.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we know why the Taguchi method is so powerful. Let's talk about how to actually use it.
The paper breaks it down into a 3-step process. The first step is choosing the right experimental design for your research.
So it's like finding the right tool for the job.
Exactly. The paper describes it as picking out a recipe for your research. There's a whole catalog of designs to choose from.
So it's like a choose-your-own-adventure book for research.
Exactly. And the paper actually provides tools and software recommendations to help you make the right choice.
That's awesome. It sounds really user-friendly.
It is. Once you've picked your design, the next step is to run the experiment and analyze the results.
So you're gathering the data and seeing what it tells you.
Exactly. You're creating your stimuli, recruiting participants, and then diving into the numbers to see what you've discovered.
And the paper talks about using something called analyses of variance to see which variables have the biggest impact.
Right. And there are other methods you can use too, depending on your specific research questions.
Okay, so you've run your experiment and you've got your results. What's the final step?
The last step is doing a follow-up study to make sure your findings are solid.
So it's like a double check.
Exactly. You want to confirm that the results hold up in a slightly different context.
That makes sense. So it's not just a one and done kind of thing.
Right. And the paper actually gives you guidance on how to choose the right comparison group for your follow-up study.
They really thought of everything.
We did. It's a really thorough process.
Okay, so we've covered the advantages of the process, but there's one more concept that I want to dig into.
What's that?
Signal-to-noise ratios.
Ah, yes. This is where things get really fascinating.
So tell me, what are these signal-to-noise ratios all about?
It's a way to measure how strong your results are, even when there's a lot of noise happening in the real world.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think of it this way. In a lab, you can control everything.
Right. It's a perfectly controlled environment.
You can isolate the variables you're studying and get those really clean results.
But the real world is a lot messier.
Exactly. There's competitor activity changes in the market. Even things like the weather can affect your results.
Right. All those things create noise that make it harder to see the true impact of your marketing.
Exactly. So the signal-to-noise ratio helps you see how well your strategy is doing, even with all that chaos.
So it's like a stress test for your marketing ideals.
Exactly. The paper gives this great example of shelf placement in a retail store.
Okay.
You could have the best packaging in the world, but if it's hidden on the bottom shelf, no one will ever see it.
True. You could have the best product ever, but if no one knows about it, it doesn't matter.
Right. So even though you might have nailed the packaging, there's all this other noise that can affect whether people actually buy it.
And the Taguchi approach helps you account for all that real-world stuff when you're designing your research.
Exactly.
Okay, I think we've gone pretty deep into the technical details here, but I want to take a step back. What does all this mean for someone who's not a marketing researcher?
Well,
why should they care about this Taguchi method?
That's a great question. I think the biggest takeaway is that this approach can help all of us make better marketing decisions.
How so?
It lets us move beyond those really simplistic studies and really dig into the complexity of how marketing works in the real world.
So it's not just some academic exercise.
Yeah.
It has real practical value.
Absolutely. Imagine you're launching a social media campaign.
Okay.
You could use the Taguchi method to test different combinations of how often you're posting, what kind of content you're sharing, and who you're targeting.
To see which combination gets the most engagement.
Exactly. And you wouldn't have to run tons of different experiments to figure it out.
That's pretty awesome. That's a superpower for marketers.
I like that. And the paper also talks about some bigger implications for the field of marketing as a whole.
Oh, like what?
Well, one thing they talk about is the potential for building better theories.
As opposed to just testing out specific hypotheses.
Right. The Taguchi method lets us explore a wider range of variables and relationships, which can lead to new insights and more complete theories about consumer behavior.
So it's not just about getting better results from a specific campaign. It's about deepening our understanding of marketing as a whole.
Exactly. And they also suggest that this approach can help reduce bias in research.
Bias? How so?
Well, sometimes researchers can be so focused on proving their hypothesis that they might miss other possibilities.
It's like that saying, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Exactly. But the Taguchi approach encourages researchers to consider a bunch of hypotheses at the same time, which helps us avoid those blind spots and see the data more objectively.
So it's not just about efficiency. It's about getting more accurate and insightful results.
Precisely. And honestly, this whole paper has been eye-opening for me. I'm excited to see how researchers use the Taguchi method in new and innovative ways.
Me too. It feels like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible with this.
I agree.
All right, well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive into the Taguchi method.
I agree. It's been a fascinating journey.
It has. And we've learned so much about how this powerful tool can be used to improve marketing research and make more informed decisions.
And if you're listening and you're as intrigued by this method as we are, Be sure to check out the show notes for a link to the full paper.
Absolutely. It's worth a read,
Yeah.
even if you don't have a background in research. I think you'll find it surprisingly engaging.
Definitely. Okay, so until next time,
Keep revising and resubmitting.
and keep those marketing minds sharp,
And if you're loving these deep dives into, the world of academic research,
especially the ones that sound kind of boring at first, but then turn out to be super interesting.
yeah, those are the best ones. Then make sure to hit that subscribe button for Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
And if you're enjoying the show, we'd really appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star rating.
It really helps other curious listeners discover the podcast.
Until next time, keep revising and resubmitting.
And keep learning.